What's up, everybody? It's Jeffrey Lyles, welcoming you to another edition of Lyles Figure Files. As you can tell from my shirt, I'm all about Superman today. I had a lot of fun breaking down all the different contenders for the definitive version of Cyborg Superman in figure form. And today I decided let's take another look at another character from the reign of Superman. And now there's lots of options, but right now there's only one who has enough that I can break this down. So we've got Steel, the Man of Steel, got the Cyborg Superman. Mafex has shown that they've got a Superboy and the Last Son of Krypton coming to us, but not yet. So that means today's focus is on Steel. And Steel was a really great character. Like all the different contenders to the throne, he had his distinct S shield. And you can notice here, his is silver. A little bit of foreshadowing that I didn't pick up on until just recently, actually. But you can see he's got his silver shield and it's got the rivets in there, arguing to what his outfit would look like. John Henry Irons was basically the unconscious of this entire storyline. He wasn't claiming to be Superman, unlike the other three. He said, Superman saved my life. I'm trying to honor his legacy, trying to do right by Superman and the people of Metropolis. And if I'm going to keep the shield on, I'm going to make sure that I represent Superman properly. And he's got this big honking hammer, just knocks out stuff. He's fighting gangs. Along the way, he's fighting the different Supermen, not for some sort of like turf war thing, but to be like, you guys are going way crazy. And this is not what Superman would want. So he's tangling with Superboy, the Metropolis Kid. And then he's also fighting the Last Son of Krypton. And both of them, he's like, listen, you guys need to get this together. And they come away kind of uneasy allies. Superboy feels bad. He's like, darn, man, maybe I'm not quite the hero I thought I was. So he got through to him. He got through to the Last Son of Krypton. And maybe not so coincidentally, he did not have a confrontation with Cyborg Superman until later. And then in Return of Superman, he's back. He's rocking a black outfit with a silver shield, which I just kind of pieced together today. And it's wild because I've read this story so many times. But look, you've got Superman here with his silver shield. You've got Steel with his silver shield. Just kind of suggesting, letting you know that Steel is a really good, important character in the mythos of DC Comics. So that said, hey, they're different contenders now. We've got enough options. What is the definitive figure of Steel? So again, breaking down four categories, just like the four Supermen, I'm taking a look at likeness. And that category is simply how close does the figure line up with the comic book inspiration? Number two, the articulation. How well does the figure move? I mean, these are action figures. I'm not taking a look at statues or semi-posed figures. They need to be able to move and do some cool stuff like we've seen in the comic book itself. Next up, accessories. Now, this one, I kind of have to be a little bit cautious in terms of how I'm balancing and how I'm looking at the different companies, the different brands, because some try to pack a lot of accessories in, while others are just what are the essential ones. So that one I'm not going to rate as highly in terms of how the overall score comes. This is one where it's like the accessories are a bonus, not this hugely weighted factor in terms of the best version of this particular figure. So then the final one is the price, and that's kind of self-explanatory. All right, am I getting a good deal for this if I wanted to buy this one version of this character in 2023? It's not like, oh, if I had a time machine and could go back to whenever year this figure came out and got it for $20, great deal. No, I'm looking at right now. If you were to track this figure down, is it still a good value? So now let's introduce the contestants for best Steel figure ever. First off, let's do it in order. The DC Direct Steel. Now, this is a really, really impressive figure. It's massive. I mean, you can just see this is a huge figure. It really captures the presence of John Henry Irons. He's got his hammer, and I'm going to have to give that a little deal with some hot water there because it's getting a little bent up and all that good stuff. But a really impressive figure. Next up is the DC Superheroes line version of Steel. And this is pretty much the precursor to the DC Classics figure. The Four Horsemen knocked this sculpt out so well, they decided we don't need to go back and do another Steel for DC Classics. We've got a great version of Steel right here, right now. No need to revisit them. And then next up, is the Mafex steel. Really impressive, really strong character. Now, those are the three versions of those of steel that we've got right now in figure form. And just to give you a prettier look at them so you can actually see them close up without my camera going in and out of focus, here you go again. This is the DC Direct, the Mafex version, and of course, the DC Superheroes version of Steel. There's one more contender in this, and that is the McFarlane version of Steel, and a really strong contender right away. He hasn't come out yet, so unfortunately, I can't break him down like I will some of the other ones, but there's a really good, really strong looking figure, and I want to throw him into the mix as well. So that's it. Let's go through the different looks. And let's take a look again, because I feel like it's really important to take a look at the comic book inspiration as I'm going through Steel on this. Now, Steel was primarily drawn in The Man of Steel by John Bogdanovich. Great artist, and he had a really great style. So his Steel looked like a black dude in wearing a suit of armor. It wasn't just like this mask, basically. He's huge, he's big, and a massive human being. So you can see important elements of this outfit we need to pay attention to. The S shield with the rivets along here, the rivets in the helmet piece, the little gauntlet here, and then the wrist cannons on the left arm, and of course, the big, massive hammer that he's rocking with. So let's take a look. First off, the DC Direct version of Steel, and he's got those rivets. Not quite sure if you'll be able to make them out, but I think you can in the helmet. So it gets those points really big, really massive. That's important for sure with Steel. His S shield also has the rivets, comic book accurate belt, including these pouches here. And then you can see the jetpack feeder from here in here for his boots there. That's really nicely done. And then those parts here of the boots, those cutout sections, that's cool. The wrist cannon, of course, that looks really great, really well done. And one of the things to pay attention to for sure, he has the yellow S shield on the back of his cape. And as you can see, he is just really huge, massive. And that's my favorite thing about this figure. He just looks imposing. He is not taking anything from anybody. A really strong looking version of Steel. So really like that about him. Now, in terms of likeness, in terms of that color scheme, you can see that it's not quite what it looks like. There we go, a little bit better for you. Actually, let's do it this way so you can see his color scheme doesn't quite match up properly to how it looks in the comic book. He's more of a silver with some blue shading, blue highlighting. That's that comic book thing where it's not going to be one solid color. Now, clearly, two-tone Steel here. You can see he's got some silver, and he's got this dark charcoal gray color scheme that doesn't quite match up with how he appears in the comic. But otherwise, a really good, really strong likeness. Then we move on to the Four Horsemen sculpted DC Superheroes version of Steel. And this figure, really strong. Again, he's got the rivets in his helmet piece as well. That's great and really, really cool to see. I thought we got him in focus perfect just a second ago. Let's try that one more time. You can see he's got the rivets on his shield perfectly set up. I love this metallic shield. That's really great. It's one of my favorite parts about the figure. And this is not designed to be a perfect rendition from Reign of the Supermen. This is just a great version of Steel, but it works in it just fine as well. You can see the wrist cannon sculpted perfectly. And that's really great. I just love all the rivets. All that detailing shows the attention to detail. This stripe is a new element for the second version of Steel's costume. You can see again the cutout section on the boots, accurate as well. The piping stretching down from the belt pouch to the boots for the jets to take off and exhaust, all that good stuff. The rivets along his shoulder pads. Then you take a look at the back. No yellow shield here, so that's missing. I'm not quite sure that's accurate to that second costume as he was starting to get himself separate a little bit from Superman, but really strong sculpt. He stands out really well against the other DC collectible or DC superheroes slash DC classics figures. Really good version of Steel, but you can tell again he's rocking this color scheme with the dark gray and the silver. So it's not quite the same as how he appears in the comic book. Now we get to the Mafex version, and Mafex is like the first thing we're going to make sure we do is get this comic book likeness down with the colors. That's going to be one of our main priorities. So he actually has the comic book accurate blue, light blue or silvery blue setup there, which makes him look so good compared to the other versions of Steel. And that's really cool. It helps him so much. Let's just take a look at him with the straight up colors, because this one you can see properly as intended. So you can see the rivets here on his helmet. That looks really great. I wish they had done a little bit of darkening around his eyes just to have more of that comic book look, but that's really close to it anyway. He's got the rivets on the shoulder pads and the S shield. It has a little touch of silver, clearly not as bright as the DC Classics version or DC Superheroes, but the coloring of the armor is spot on with that silvery blue color scheme. The wrist cannon looks really, really great. And the pouches, dead on accurate to how it looks in the comic book, which is another plus. And you knew Mafex was not going to slack off. They've got the piping down properly. And I just think that's so impressive that all three of these figures have that aspect of Steel down. That's not something that any of them shortchanged. Got that perfectly down. And again, the boot cutouts perfectly on there as well. So made sure they got all those elements. But you can see here, there's some differences between this one and the Mafex one, because it has 2 slots here, but it also has one by the feet. I couldn't look around enough to see if Steel actually has this one on the feet, but I'm assuming simply because of how Mafex pays attention to details with the comic book likeness, that's the correct version. So as you can see here, he really stands out pretty strongly compared to the other ones. But let's take a look at this McFarlane one, because it's the new contender. It's in the mix as well. And like most McFarlane figures, they're not trying to do a direct comparison to any one comic book storyline. This is more of a generic shield. This is more of a generic Steel, but they made sure to get all the proper elements down. So you see the rivets in the helmet, but note they're absent here on the shield itself. And there's some battle damage, so that's kind of an interesting touch with that. He's got the big cape that's hovering over his shoulders. The shoulder pads are also different, but they still got the rivets there. Really nice to see that. The wrist cannon intact as well, because you cannot do Steel and miss the wrist cannon. It's important to have that because that's one of his offensive distance abilities, firing projectiles from his left arm or left wrist. And then you've got the belt, and that's pretty close to that as well. But if you notice, the jetpack strip here from the pouch to the boots is missing. So that is definitely one thing that's going to cost us some points in terms of accuracy, and something McFarlane took a shortcut on. I wouldn't necessarily call it a shortcut, but it's definitely something that they decided wasn't as important as the other likenesses, that made sure they included that with all of their different versions of Steel, making sure that, hey, if we have nothing else, we're going to make sure that we got that part of his outfit properly. Now, I want to make sure to address the hammer as well. And I think all of them are pretty well sized and scale compared to Steel, with the exception of the DC Direct one. Now, in the comic book, his hammer is basically as tall as him. And you can see quite obvious that this one is a little bit shorter. I mean, it's not a massive problem, but it should be about this size to Steel, where it is definitely taller and bigger than him. And you can see that with the DC Superheroes version. He is definitely rocking a big hammer that is basically his height. And, you want to be able to do the two-handed grip here. So you've got that capability really easily with this one. You're not going to be able to get much of a convincing two-hand pose with Steel, and his hammer with a DC Direct one. I mean, you can, but it's not necessarily as imposing or as impressive just because that hammer isn't as big. Definitely not the problem with the Mafex one because it's taller than steel standing up, and that's really great to see. The McFarlane one, I think, is a pretty decent size, but we can't really see a whole lot because of this one angle of this one picture we've gotten so far. And again, I really wish McFarlane Steel was out so I could do a full, better comparison of this figure. But we kind of work with what we've got. So from there, let's move on to articulation. And as you know, I mean, a DC Direct figure basically is not going to have much articulation. He gets about this much range out of his hip. And these joints are so old, and I want to break them showing them off, but that's about as much range as you can get. He can do his kick that far. Yeah, this is about the extent of a flying pose for him. Not great. His head can turn. His side, he can do that as well, but he is really not going to do too much. You can see here, he does not have too much range on his shoulders. Some of that's because of the sculpting of the shoulder pads, where they want to go up too high and mess up that piece. So for this guy, you know, he was never going to win the articulation category. DC Direct figures were meant to just be posed on the shelf, not doing really cool action shots. The DC Superheroes version, though, can do a lot with his movement. He is not hampered whatsoever by the piping there. You see they're flexible, so he can do all kinds of stuff. No problem with them. Can't really do much of a split, but he has that great movement there, and he does not have much range for an overhead shot. He can't do the hammer smash, but you can see he can do pretty much what you want him to do on that end. And of course, you can do this little swing deal. Doesn't have a whole lot of waist articulation. My figure might be just stuck, but he can do something on that end. His arms go about this high, so again, he's got that restriction as well. But he can get some firing off from the wrist cannon poses pretty well, pretty nicely on that end. And of course, he can do the one hand hammer grab as well. Mafex comes roaring through one more time with some really, really great articulation. I shot this figure, so let me just show you some of those pictures, because I think they do a better job of just showing exactly everything that's possible with this character compared to me just saying, oh yeah, he can move really well. I mean, he's got some great movement because he can really be posed around and do some really fun, really great stuff. Here's just a few shots of him in action, throwing down. He can swing that hammer, bashing Mongol in the face. That's always cool. This is a little bit of revenge for everybody hanging out in Coast City. Here's another shot of how he looks. And he can do some pretty nice flying scenes. You see that he's not so encumbered by the shoulder articulation like some of these other figures. He can get that out pretty far, and his shoulder pauldrons move up enough that they're not in the way whatsoever. And that's really cool. Of course, with the cloth cape, he's not hampered, not restricted pretty much whatsoever by this, which is kind of a restriction from some of those other figures where they just have to be bound by, hey, he can only do but so much. Here's him running in action with Superman, and you can see again the cape is an asset because you can pose it. It's a movable cape. It's got wiring inside, so you can do all kinds of stuff that you want to do with that cape too, which is really, really helpful in terms of like, hey, what kind of cool fun stuff can I get away with steel in action? And here is my shot that I just think is really great because you can see Steel can pull off basically a really great overhead hammer shot, which is something that none of these other figures can do. And that's just great to be able to do that with him in action and go, hey, I want to have him smashing somebody with that hammer overhead. Here's another look at it. So you can really definitely get some fun shots of him doing the hammer swing, going in action like that. And it's just so fun to do. Here's another one. He can hold the hammer back. That is just something you could not do with the other steel figures. Here's one more with him running with Superman. So he has a lot of really great movement, and clearly he is winning on this articulation category. Now let's take a look at the McFarlane one. We kind of know what we expected from this point with McFarlane. So you can see he's got some shoulder movement, which is nice. That's good. He's got what appears to be double jointed elbows. That'll help with articulation. The torso joint seems to move pretty well. So he's got a little tilt working. Not quite sure how much range he's got with his neck piece and the head. So it looks pretty decent. It looks like this will move up to a certain extent, but I'm wondering if the cape is going to restrict that like it does with the DC Direct and DC Classics version. He doesn't have that wiring from the jetpack from the belt down to the boots for his boot jets. So you know that's not going to be hampered whatsoever. So he should have pretty decent range on that end. But again, Mafex is scoring pretty high. So for now, Mafex wins with the likeness. They're winning on the articulation. There's two more categories. Can any other competition match up with Mafex? And so let's see. Let's take a look at the accessories that come with these guys. Here's a DC Direct one. He's got the hammer. Now, that's what you really absolutely must have with a steel figure. You cannot not have the hammer. So he's got that. Like I said, it's a little bit too small, but it's pretty decent. You have it, good thickness, and looks pretty good. I just wish it were taller and this hammer piece was wider and thicker, so it looked like it would cause some damage. Kind of like the DC Superheroes version, which looks like that hammer piece, that head section, it's massive. It looks like it could crush something and do some real damage outside of just like, just being there. And again, it's got a really great height, size to it, so it's not a chumpy hammer. He's rocking some serious hardware with it. Again, this is just the only piece of, accessories that we're getting from that version. Now let's take a quick look here if I can pull this up fast enough, breaking down all the accessories that come with the Mafex figure. Now, again, this is kind of not fair because Mafex goes hard on accessories. So they're making sure that, hey, we're going to throw some in here. We're going to give you a lot of accessories for your figures. So let's break down all the stuff that the Mafex steel figure has. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different sets of hands in addition to the fist, the default ones. So these are hammer holding ones. These are slightly gripping hands. They've got 2 that are pretty similar. Splayed hands, kind of not so wide open hands, but nothing to really distinguish them too much. He's got boot jet exhaust, which are really nice. That's a nice piece. Then the hammer, and you can see this is a 2-piece section to this hammer. So here's the longer piece. It plugs right in here to add that length. I almost feel like this is the size of the DC Direct hammer on its own. But in the comic book, you see that it's much taller, much larger, longer than that one. And then just to mix it up some more, we've got different head sculpts. So we've got one with a yelling head expression, like he's really focused, and then the gritted teeth, and then we've got the neutral one. So we've got everything that you could almost want. I would say I would love for them to have included a helmet off so we could have the, hey, John Henry Irons is a black guy head sculpt. But that's pretty good considering the options that we have for them. And let's take a look at the McFarlane one. Again, McFarlane's name of the game has never been accessories. They never specialize in accessories anyway. We have the hammer, and I'm pretty sure that's all we're going to get. We've seen with the Nightfall, the Flashpoint Flash, that he has an unmasked head sculpt, so maybe they throw that in for John Henry Irons so we can have his head sculpt along with the regular helmeted steel helmet version that we see right here. That would be a great addition, but I'm not holding my breath on that because they don't tend to throw in a lot of accessories. We know for sure they'll come with that black stand, and that black stand is very helpful in helping to maintain poses, so I'm not going to hate on that. But yeah, still the Mafex version takes 3 categories, so it doesn't even matter at this point. Still, from Mafex is 1, but there's one more category. Let's see how it does in this one. And this is maybe the biggest one for a lot of you out there trying to decide which steel figure should I get, and that's price. And Mafex typically is the most expensive one. You can go to some retailers and it can be over $100. But if you get it time right, you don't have to spend that much. Let's take a look. So the DC Direct version, again, which is a classic version of this guy, such a great figure. I mean, like I said at the start of this, all these figures hold up really well, and this one's really good. Not upset about having this. Still is one of my few DC Direct characters in my collection, or figures in my collection. That one is going to run you, if you want to get a mint-on card version of this, it's going to run you $90. So that's not cheap, especially considering the advances in technology with accessories, articulation. You're basically getting a statue for $90. So he doesn't win in that case, but if you really like this look, and I think it's a solid version of steel, you're going to pay $90 to get this one. For the DC superheroes figure, this is almost your best deal. He's going to clock you around $45. So if you're looking to pad out your DC Classics collection, $45 for this deal. And I think he's still one of the standouts of that entire line, from DC superheroes to DC Classics. You're getting a really good figure. You're going to pay $45 for him. And then the Mafex figure. Now, this one typically would be super expensive, but right now you can get them on Amazon for $85. And for this version, with the articulated cape itself that just helps you move and pose them, the superior articulation, the great accessories, that's a really good deal. And then the McFarlane one, you got to assume they're going to keep their prices pretty consistent. So he's going to be in $20, $23, that price point. I think that's a really good deal for that figure. That's not necessarily the most comic book accurate, but if you wanted a good 7-inch version of a figure that has some really good articulation and it's a solid feel to the figure, you're not going to get a better value than that one. So ultimately, where am I going with this one? What's the definitive steel figure? Now, I've run through the different figures, the really great DC Direct version, the still fantastic DC superhero steel, the Mafex steel, and of course, last but not least, the DC Toys or DC Multiverse McFarlane Toys version. I've got to say, based off of the comic book likeness, the articulation, the accessories, and the price, which isn't terrible, it's still pretty comparable to most of these figures, the winner, not surprisingly, not shockingly at this point, is the Mafex one. And I feel like every time I'm doing this, Mafex is still coming out ahead. They just knock these figures out. The love, the attention they put into these figures with the accessories, really trying to make sure they have all the different factors that go along with the storyline, the likeness, like with the shield in the back, being able to move and pose the cape, adds so much more fun to it. Getting that direct likeness with the perfect, proper shading to the comic book look is really great. And they decided to focus. That's awesome. So all this great stuff with this figure really makes him the winner, the standout in terms of the definitive version of steel. And as I go a little bit further on along with this, I think we're going to have a really competitive one for that Nightfall Batman. We've got the DC Classics one. There's a DC Direct one, of course, from that. McFarlane Toys right now kind of has the lead. But then we got a Nightfall Batman coming from Mafex. And I think that one could be a really back and forth one. So we'll see. Of course, I'm looking forward to Mafex's Radicator and Superboy figures to see how they mash up. The Banes, putting them in action. So lots of competition, lots of great choices between the best definitive versions of these characters still to come. So let me know which one you guys think stands out as your favorite steel figure. Is it the DC Direct one, the DC Superheroes version, or the Mafex one? Or if you're just holding out to say, hey, what's going on with McFarlane Toys and their DC Multiverse one? As always, thank you so much for watching. This episode of the House Figure Files has been filed.